My name is Carrie Rawson. My dad is Dennis Rader, otherwise known as the BTK killer, which stands for Find, Torture, Kill. So I grew up in Wichita, Kansas. I grew up with an older brother in a really normal, like what felt like a normal family. Um, Midwest, middle class, like 3-bedroom ranch, large yard, just normal life. Grandparents lived down the street. My dad's parents lived like 3 miles away. So we did a ton of stuff with family. We were always doing things with family for holidays and campouts and cookouts. Um, my dad was basically like my best friend. So I went fishing and camping with him a lot. We did a lot of family vacations, especially like all over the West. We went to the Grand Canyon, Disneyland. I mean, you name it, we probably went and did it. So, um, I mean, if you can separate who my dad is now, I know people have a hard time with that. Like, they don't really believe me when I'm like, tell them how good life was. But I mean, it was just pretty much idyllic. And then in
Were there
2000,
any signs when you had in this idyllic childhood that you had, looking back on that reflection, were there any signs, any indicators whatsoever that your father not necessarily was BTK, but had those predisposition, had those inclinations? Did you see a dark side to him? Did you see interactions between him and maybe your family members or members of the public that, looking back, raised red flags at the time? Or was it truly a tale of two people within him?
I think, well, in hindsight, you can definitely look back and point to those yellow flags and red flags in my father when I was growing up. I can match the timeline of like my dad's murders, his last three when I was alive, when I was little kids, when I was like 6 and 7 and 12.
What were those like, if you can describe?
Sure. So before, like going back now, like you still have to sort of separate. So I try to keep like my dad still as my dad, and then those things I know now about my dad's other life. But even if you just separate out the worst things my father did, he still could be pretty hard on us. Like he could be controlling. So I mean, I grew up in what I would say was a verbally and emotionally abusive home. So I sit there and I just told you how idyllic it was, but that's because I think I didn't really even know the difference between like how I should have been treated by my father at times, or how my mother should have been treated, how my brother should have been treated. What a normal like father would be, or a normal like relationship would be for in marriage. So even if you separate out the murders, like, he just had these controlling moments with like wanting your shoes in a certain place, or wanting to sit at a certain chair at a table, at the kitchen table. So if he was home, that was dad's chair, you couldn't sit there. You let him kind of go first with things. You let him sort of set the tone. When he got kind of loud and controlling, my mom would just send him outside. So I would spend a lot of time with him outside because he would relax and be more like my dad. So after 2005, when we found out who he was, when he was arrested in February 2005, I started matching up the timeline. So I went back. I wasn't alive for 7 of them. They were in the 70s. My mom was pregnant with me with the 7th one in 77. So even that, matching up that timeline, it took me a while to just absorb that. So when you match up the timeline then in 85, my dad murdered our neighbor lady down the street, Mrs. Hedge, Maureen Hedge. She was in her early 50s. She was a widow. So when I was 6, I knew she had gone missing. Somehow at 6, I knew Maureen Hedge had gone missing. And I knew they had found her body like a week later, or yeah, about a week later, strangled out in the countryside. But I didn't know, of course, that it was my father. But even at 6, like a 6-year-old shouldn't know these things, right? But somehow I did. So either I knew it from the TV being on, because, back then in the 80s, the news would have just been on at night. or my parents were talking about it, because I know my parents talked about it, and my dad literally told my mom, well, I think it was her boyfriend, the man that had taken her on a date.
You remember hearing this conversation between your parents where your father said,
yeah. And I remember like a police officer coming around interviewing my mom, canvassing the neighborhood I was out playing on a pogo stick. I remember that clearly. And I remember him just asking my mom general questions, at the time. I don't even know if they interviewed my father, because he would have been at work that day when they came around canvassing.
Do you remember if your mother and the neighbor woman, Maureen Hedge, if they were friends or friendly, or if your parents hung out with them at all, or was there a relationship with that neighbor, or was she just a neighbor at that point?
An acquaintance. We would walk by. So she lived between me and my mom's parents. So she lived 2 houses down from my mom's parents, around the corner, and 7 from us. So we would walk by and say hi if she was out like raking in her yard or gardening. And so my father would have spoken to her. It was more just a passing hello, how are you? We weren't really, we were friendly in a neighborhood way, but not like friends. Mm-hmm. But it was this massive thing in my life when I was 6, when she went missing. And when I was 6, I knew my father was gone. He had been out camping on a Cub Scout camp out with my older brother as a leader. So I knew that, because there had been a thunderstorm the night she went missing. I slept with my mom because I was scared with the storm. I wouldn't have ever been in my mom's bed if my dad had been home. Mm-hmm. So I know this stuff, right? And then in 2005, February 25th, 2005, the FBI agent knocks on my door, and he's notifying me that my dad is BTK. Not that the FBI thinks he is, or they're questioning him. Literally, your dad is BTK. So I'm sitting here trying to alibi my dad. I'm asking about dates. So he mentions the September of 86 one. And then that's when it hit me. Okay, Maureen Hedge was murdered in 85. She was our neighbor. I don't think it was ever solved. I'm literally telling the FBI agent on the day of my father's arrest about Mrs. Hedge. And my father was not arrested for Mrs. Hedge. He was arrested on the 7 in the 1970s that they had DNA on, and the 86 one they had DNA on. So he was not arrested that day on Hedge, or Davis, the last one in 91. So I'm literally going from like having a conversation with the FBI agent, defending my dad, alibying him, defending the man that I told you about that was idyllic. And I literally just like, it was like my guts just twisted in half when I realized Mrs. Hedge's murder, had happened so closely, had not been solved. And I said, her phone line was cut. I believe BTK cuts phone lines. And literally the FBI agent stopped me, and he called back in to Wichita to like the agents back then. And later that day, my father confessed to all 10, including Hedge. But I literally like turned my father in on Mrs. Hedge within like 30 minutes of talking to that agent that day. And so when you're asking like about putting it all together, putting those 2 sides of my father together, in hindsight now, I can remember my dad being gone. I can remember like his hit kit. If I go read about the case in detail, I can put together his details of like how he had set up his MO, and had set up this like fake alibi and things. And I remember his hit kit being this bowling bag that he used for that one. So the thing is, with hindsight, like I can sit here and tell you, okay, he fits this, but it's not like investigators back then would have even had that information to put out there.
Right. And you talk about this quote hit kit, which is sort of a colloquial term that usually is a bag. It's referred to in different phrases, but it's what murderers carry on them or in their car or have. And it includes their weapons. It includes whatever it is, certain attire, whatever it is that they use. And it is sort of created through stalking at times. And, BTKs, your father's MO, most of them were strangled or suffocated. suffocated via plastic bag, via rope, plastic bag, rope, stabbed, shot, survived. That was Kevin Bright, the one that survived. And then back in with strangled via rope, belt, hands. Your neighbor, Maureen Hedge, she was strangled via hands. And then the following two via a nylon stocking, that was Vicky Wigirl, and then Dolores Davis, the last one you mentioned, also via pantyhose. Mm-hmm. So when you talk about his hit kit, what was in that bowling bag that you knew of or was aware of?
I never would have looked in my dad's stuff. I just remember I have a vague memory of seeing a maroon and white old bowling bag, which was weird because my dad didn't bowl. We maybe bowled like twice, but my dad kept so many weird, odd things. I mean, they wouldn't have seemed odd, right? Because we can sit here in hindsight and we can say everything is weird or everything is odd. But you got to remember you're talking to somebody that was 6 in 1985 that, loved her dad. Mm-hmm. So didn't think her dad would hurt a flea. So I literally just remember vaguely seeing a maroon and white bowling bag over by the door. And the reason he put those things you were talking about, we can assume what was in there. You would have to ask him or go find like his memories of what was in that specific bag. The reason he did that is because he went out camping that weekend on a Cub Scout camp out, that he faked that he was in his tent. He left. He parked at a bowling alley. He went in. He chugged some beer real quick to make it smell on his breath like he had been drinking. He pretended he was drunk. He got a taxi cab out to our neighborhood. Then he proceeded to murder Mrs. Hedge. He removed her body from her house. He actually took her to our church, took Polaroids of her and like dressed her up in like bondage and plastic bags and things and took Polaroids. Then he dumped her out in the country a couple miles from her church. So that's another thing, because in hindsight, you can put all these little details together. Like they found pine needles that were out of place next to Mrs. Hedge's body. Well, there aren't a lot of pines in Kansas, but there were pines planted at our church, very tall pines that I would climb when I was a kid. So again, it's those little things now in hindsight I can pull out, like that's where the pine needles came from. So he then took Mrs. Hedges' car, dropped it off back at the bowling alley, and then picked up his car and went back out camping. So he literally would commit these horrendous crimes, and then he would go right back out to Boy Scouts and then come right home. I mean, literally in 86, he killed a mom in front of her young son on what he calls a long lunch hour, which is his quote, and then came home and had dinner with us.
You mentioned earlier the yellow and red flags, and you mentioned his exhibitions of a controlling type behavior, his chair, his seat, etc. Again, putting the hindsight application, the second layer, after he committed these unspeakable murders, did you notice in him a calmness? Did you notice in him a satisfaction, a slower to temper? Did you notice an excitement? Was there any change in behavior that you could see as palpable after he had engaged in these murders?
Yeah. So in the 91 one, Dolores Davis, in January of 91, I was 12 by then. So of course, I'm twice as old now, so I know my dad better. And he had been laid off from ADT in 88. And then he was working with the Census Bureau off and on. Those were hard years for us because his income had been cut, and it was very hard on my dad when he didn't have a job. So he was full out of work most of 1990. So he was very depressed. And then my mom got sick with pneumonia. So she was in the hospital for like 12 days with pneumonia at the end of 1990. And he was having a hard time managing like a 7th grader and a 10th grader. And he was trying to be Mr. Mom. And, he was tense and very stressed. Like he had a small accident in like off of our driveway with the car, fender bender, it was not a pleasant time to be home with dad and have mom in the hospital. Right. So mom comes home and he goes camping. Again, this time with Boy Scouts, like the Trappers Rendezvous. So it's a winter camp out. So we assume he's out camping for the weekend. Well, Mrs. Davis goes missing, and she lived basically at an intersection a couple miles down from us and a mile from the church. So in this case, he literally used our family Oldsmobile to move her body. Like the car that I then will drive back and forth to high school, a few years later. So when you're talking about seeing a change in him, he was all tense and depressed and worried and just not pleasant to be around. And then as soon as Mrs. Davis was murdered, he was more relaxed and more himself, because he in his words, he says it's like a pot that boils slowly and it has to be released. And so he normally would just stalk and troll and then have fantasies, have what he called like bondage motel parties and dress up and, wear victims' clothing and things like that, and did his own Polaroids. But he said occasionally he would spill over, and he basically says he had to murder. So he puts it back on the victims. And so it's really hard in hindsight to sit here and say, okay, things got better in my family when that happened in another family.
Yeah. From what we understand of BTK's, of your father's youth, he exhibited a lot of violent tendencies toward animals, which is a standard pre-indicator for people who later murder humans and the like. Did you ever see him interact with animals in a violent way? Did you have a family pet? When you all those family times that you had in the gatherings and holidays, did he interact with relatives' animals?
So we had 2 dogs growing up. So we had Patches, which was a Brittany Spaniel. So Patches was a Brittany Spaniel, and then we had Dudley later on, a Springer Spaniel. So when he was around us, he always treated those dogs very loving, like took him on walks. I would go on walks with him all the time, was one of the things we did. And he took really good care of them. But from 91 until he was arrested, he was a compliance officer and animal control officer for Park City. So there were reports, especially after he was arrested, that some people's dogs had gone missing, like never made it to the animal shelter, or people's cats had gone missing. And then people would talk about him being controlling about, it was his job to make sure the yards were mowed and, like rundown cars and stuff weren't left that long, like compliance codes. But he was like neurotic about it. So he would take like a ruler and go measure people's grass and give them a ticket. So, I remember like us getting some bad phone calls and us having to change our phone number because he was ticking people off. He would take whatever he was given and he would do it to the tens. So like he made himself a whole sheriff's type uniform, like all brown. He had like a nightstick, a knife. He was like full decked out, had a shotgun in his truck. I mean, he looked just like a county sheriff. So again, in hindsight, like he actually used that job of someone as an outlet. And we do believe he did probably torture and murder some animals then as an outlet versus committing any more human murders. And so in hindsight, then when we were cleaning out our house, like I found a ton of leashes and dog collars in the attached shed. So we had this attached shed right on the side of our house. That was like Dad's space. And there would have been no reason to have that many because we only had one dog. And so I think he was collecting trophies.
Which we know that he had collected trophies from his human victims. So it's not unreasonable to think he would do the same with his animal victims as well. During this time growing up, do you remember him having any friends at all? Or were his social interactions limited to family? And of the family that you mentioned, was that your mom's side of the family, or was that both, or your father's?
We were close to both sides. We did different things with them. So my dad was pretty close to his brothers. He has 3 younger brothers. We did a lot of camping and fishing with my dad's side. They're all more like outdoors people. So like My mom doesn't go outdoors. So like I loved my dad's side of the family because like my grandparents would go to Colorado for a week and we would go RVing, just the kids with them. And we had these big like fall family campouts with like multi generations. Sometimes my mom would come out for like a day, but like she did not like the outdoors. So that's my dad's side. So he was real close to his brothers, and they were extremely torn up when everything happened, and just not. None of us have been the same. Like none of us have been the same. So my dad's father was already passed away, and his mom wasn't fully in capacity by then, so she didn't survive more than 2 years after the arrest. On my mom's side, then. We just did a lot of birthday parties and a lot of holidays together. So he wasn't as close probably to my uncles on that side. But my dad was just like the state, like, okay, if you remove BTK and again, you're talking about my dad, he was just a stand-up guy that would like do anything for anybody in the family. And then he had some friends through church, but again, they were more acquaintances, like people he would interact with on that day, or if say there was like a party or something. But like my dad didn't really have friends he went out and did things with. He always just, my mom was probably my dad's best friend. But I know I've heard stories like before I was born and when I was young, my dad used to like buddy around with guys from work at ADT. So they would have been friends, you know, when like before kids came along and everything else.
Can you, if you're willing, can you share and describe the dynamic of your parents' relationship? You say that, you know, your mom was probably his best friend, again, in hindsight, and, or if it was different, your view growing up, but did he seem to have an open, honest as possible, obviously notwithstanding this, hiding this side of him, but did they communicate? Was there a hierarchy there? What was the actual dynamic like between them?
Honestly, he seemed like a pretty good husband. I mean, again, a lot of times when I'm talking about this stuff, it's more, I'm seeing it as like through a kid's eyes and more surface level of how things look. So like he took her out to dinner a lot because that's what she liked, or we would take her to romantic movies because she wouldn't go see the action or the horror or, you know, anything scary was not my mom. So he did that with like me. But he treated her really, really well. So like he would carry the groceries in. He would take care of all the outdoor work. He would fix the car, took her on vacations. Like again, what you're seeing is like almost a perfect perception on the outside. Like you're seeing layers, right? So he talks about cubing like he has these layers. That's a term he came up with Dr. Ramsland, where he's cubing and he's flipping the cube and showing you what side. So it's almost like he had a really good husband side, you know, but then he could be verbally and emotionally abusive and controlling. And so I learned at an early age to sort of mimic my mom and learn how to handle my dad. So like I said, she would say, Dennis, go outside, go do she's like, I'll clean up dinner. You go outside, you know? So she had this way of handling him. And so I learned that like if he was getting uptight or something when we were out, like, okay, dad, you go do this and I'm going to handle this. So there was sort of like this management, you know. And my mom and I say after the arrest, it was like we had to walk on eggshells. So literally, she said it was like walking on eggshells for 30 years. So when you're looking back at these personalities of a narcissist and a psychopath, they have a tendency to gaslight and they have a tendency to love bomb. And so she really hadn't dated anybody else. She knew all of his family before she knew him. He came back from the military. He had served during the Vietnam era. He literally came back in his uniform. They started dating. It was basically love at first sight, she said, and they were married 9 months later. So you have to wonder, like, how much was that legit real? Because I'll argue that they really were in love and that he loved us, but then you'll get other experts that'll come on and say psychopaths can't love. And so I'm always arguing with them about that.
Yeah. That was my question when you discussed how he's discussed cubism, was essentially whether that's a part that he is playing or a part of himself that he is showing, and whether it's sort of assuming a role or whether it's authentically a part of his personality. And perhaps we'll never know the answer. To your point, you have your perspective that's so valuable because you know him likely best out of anyone. And then we have these competing theories, perhaps by experts, that say, well, that's impossible. So going back to the shock that you mentioned that your family felt, his two younger brothers, your mom, you, this is your story to share. But notwithstanding that, can you dig a little deeper and describe for us what that shock was like for all of you? And if his younger brother said, I did notice this growing up, did they talk about the flags? How was your processing like, and your brother's processing, and your mother's?
So early on the day of my father's arrest, the FBI said we couldn't talk to anybody for a while. So it took several hours before I was able to get a hold of my mom and my brother. I was in Michigan and my brother was in Connecticut. My mom was in Wichita, and the FBI pulled us, notified each of us, and then questioned us because they needed to clear us from involvement before we could talk to each other. So my mom was in shock and I was in shock. So my uncle had to step in on my mom's side. My uncle stepped in on my mom's side really quickly, and my mom's parents, to kind of just take care of my mom. And she had to move around a lot because media was hounding everybody, in Kansas. So they were hounding me in Michigan. So we flew me to Kansas then. So I literally was shaking from shock for like 5 days. When we flew me to Kansas, we flew me into the Kansas City airport so that the media wouldn't see me in Wichita. And then we stayed with my uncle for a week. My mom moved around for several weeks, months really, with family. She never slept in her home again. Her home that had been there for 33 years, she never slept in it again after my dad's arrest. So early on, you're just kind of processing the shock. And my mom always said it was like my dad had died. Like that's one of the ways my mom's dealt with it, is that she came home from lunch and my dad wasn't there and it was like he had died. But then I'm always like, well, how do you grieve a person that's not dead, and how do you grieve a person that's infamous? Because the whole world is telling you how god awful your father is, and he did god awful things, but he wasn't most of the time god awful to you. So how do you even have the right to grieve this person? And you're international news, so everything you do is public, And so we were really just more dealing with the shock of what happened and trying to process it and understand it. But within a few days of being at my uncle's, my mom was on the phone with our family pastor who was at the jail with my dad. And my dad said, tell Paula, I have a sexual problem. Like, my dad had already confessed to the police. He literally was confessing to the pastor and confessing to us within days of his arrest, saying, I have problems, and I am the person that did this. I remember sitting by my mom on my aunt and uncle's bed, and my mom's got like this yellow notepad and she's writing notes and she's using her pen and she's pointing at it while she's on the phone, like writing out like sexual dysfunction and then showing me, And so it took a lot of time for all of us to deal with these things. Like, we all sort of had to deal with it individually. When you're talking about a Midwest traditional family, like, we don't talk about bad stuff, right? Like, like when you're all together with a funeral, even, like, you're just talking and eating and you're not talking about your feelings or emotions. Like, I never grew up talking about emotions. My dad had this whole, like, you don't talk about sex, politics, or religion rule. Well, I mean, it was a pretty traditional, conservative, quiet families. And what trauma does is it gets in there and it shatters. So it shattered my immediate family, and it took some time. But I mean, we're not a family. We lost my dad, and then it just imploded us. And it imploded my father's family too. Part of it is because the glue was already dying from old age. We had already lost the glue of my grandpa, and then we lost my grandma. And so there weren't any more family campouts. for me. Now, they've all continued that on, but part of the reality of living far away and everything else, it's not what it was, because my father literally imploded everybody. And then everybody in my family do not talk about it. It's been 18 years and they don't talk about it. I'm the only person that talks about it. And I didn't start talking about it till almost 10 years after my father was arrested. And then I had to manage all of that, of all of a sudden, I'm okay, Mom, we're going to be in the media. I'm going to be on your front page in the morning. I'm going to be on the front page, of that newspaper rolled up at my grandparents' driveway because I'm done being quiet. So I'm literally still the only one that talks about it.
And you are an advocate for abuse and trauma. And how has your messaging and your advocacy helped your own processing and your own grief management?
So when I finally started talking about everything my family had been through and what my dad did to us and how I had worked through everything in trauma, I have PTSD and worked on forgiveness and stuff with my faith. People started coming to me and saying, hey, something you're saying is helping us. Either they were a war veteran with PTSD or trauma victim, survivor, had grown up with abuse, had survived abuse as an adult, or had violent crime happen to them, or they had family members that were criminals. So all these people started coming, and they're still coming. And I didn't expect that. It's like I was balled up and dying inside, holding everything I'm talking to you about in for almost 10 years, not telling hardly anybody. And then finally I was given the outlet to talk about it. And then all these people showed up and said, hey, you're helping. Like, you're helping us, and talking was helping me. And it was like this brilliant moment of like, oh, okay, now I have something I can do with this. Like, all this horrible, horrible crap happened that I didn't want to survive and I didn't want to live. And I had to keep making the decision, and I still do 18 years later. Okay, I can't go back and change time. I can't go back and save those 10 lives. I can't stop my dad. What can I do now? And I had to I still have to make that decision every day. What do I do now? What do I do with this? And it was like a gift to me when all these people showed up that needed help. And so now, like, beyond talking about what I've been through to try to get people more educated about people like my father, what to look for, to expand criminology textbooks about psychopathy and victimology and criminology, which is what I'm doing. I'm like day to day working on like missing people's cases, or advocating for domestic violence victims, or working with the media quietly. Like, okay, over here, this needs some eyes. This needs a story, and this is the person that you can talk to. And so I'm like literally over here learning to connect and advocate. And I'm like a baby. I don't even know what I'm doing most of the time with it still. So, but it's like what I'll be doing the rest of my life now is advocacy. So that is like a massive gift to me, to have been brought up by a serial killer, raised really tough and strong. And now I can go use that strength and knowledge to go help other people. So that's really what it's about now.
And it's my understanding that you're strong in your faith, and that's played a large part as well in your processing. And as you were just saying that, I was thinking about the scripture, all things work for the good of those who love the Lord. Mm-hmm. And therefore your grief and trauma, as you just articulated, unbeknownst to you, you were helping others, and you were serving as a magnet for them. And you think you don't know what you're saying or doing, as you just said, but whatever you are feeling and however you are articulating it as you are processing it is helping others. You are changing and likely saving lives.
Yeah,
what does that mean to you?
It means a lot, because it's really hard like to live with this freaking PTSD and live this life under the spotlight. Like any little thing I tweet or something can become news. It's crazy. It's crazy nuts over here. So, but like the thing is, it's my dad that took me to church, right? My parents, all my family were Lutheran. We sat in this pew with both sets of my grandparents. Like every Sunday, you had to go to church. Like my dad, it was my dad and my mom. Okay, you're going to get dressed up. You're going to take a shower the night before. Like I hated that part. I hated dressing up. I'm a total tomboy. My dad was like shining his shoes military to go to church. And then he served. So he was like in communion. He was like an assistant pastor. I literally was acolyting next to my father while he's assistant pastoring in the same church that he brought Mrs. Hedges' body to. I mean, that's the reality of this insane life over here. But I was brought up with this faith, and then I walked from it, and then found God really, truly, personal relationship down in the Grand Canyon in 97, which was a crazy trip with my father. It was just like literally rock bottom. And after that, things got better for me. This was years before he was arrested. So I had built up like an evangelical faith. Then in college with Campus Crusade for Christ, met my husband then through that. And so that really was one of the foundations that saved me when my father was arrested, because I didn't think I was going to make it through that first hour or that first night. I remember praying through like like Psalm 23, and I'm never good at scripture memorization. So there's just little bits would come to me, like the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Whom shall I be afraid? And I've said that over and out loud 1,000,000 times since then. So when my faith is what, without my faith, I wouldn't be here.
And when you said that was a crazy trip with your dad in the Grand Canyon, what do you mean by that?
Oh gosh. So I write a whole section in my book about it because I needed to, because when I was starting to learn to write, I needed to find my dad again and not BTK. So that's where I focused to begin with. But so in May of 97, we had been out to the canyon a few times. We had stayed on the rim a few years before that. And my dad had researched. He said he had everything under control, like just the narcissism was in there. But of course, I didn't realize. I just trusted him. I'm like an 18-year-old that's just trusting my dad that we're going to go have this grand adventure, and then we ended up in the Grand Canyon. Oh, he didn't even want to go on the popular trails. That was my dad. He always wanted to camp away from people, do his own thing, get us in trouble and danger. So within hours, we were dehydrated. We didn't have enough water. We were on this really rocky, unmaintained trail. We had to take our bags off. My cousin that was my age was with me. My brother was supposed to be with us, but he was sick. So he stayed up on the ledge. But then my dad told him he could come down later on his own. So he got into all of this trouble later on his own, my brother. He even got lost. It was just this whole insane thing my dad had taken us on where really, we all could have died, because the first night we didn't even make it to water. You have to make it to water within your days, because you can't carry enough with you in like 90-degree heat. So we were camping in the rocks the first night. We only had like a cup of water. And the next day, then I remember we were camping. We had to stay under a rock for shade. So we didn't even make it to like our campsites the first 2 nights. So literally, I mean, the first day I think I was probably almost delirious from heat, but I also was suicidal at that time. And of course I hadn't told my parents, because I had lost my cousin in an accident months before, and my dad's dad to cancer. So I literally was dealing with suicide ideation my freshman year in college. But of course I didn't tell my strict Midwest parents, because you don't tell them things. So I almost threw myself over the ledge that first day in the canyon. And it was like something came up against me and saved me, and that's when I actually started talking to God again and praying. And that's where I found him that week. But I literally was down there wanting to like kill my dad. Like 4 or 5 days in, my dad's miserable, and he's like, why don't you just leave me here? And so now in hindsight, I'm like, I should have just left him in the canyon. But like, there's such a metaphor, I think, to that, of of like, you see my dad's narcissism and his grand ideas, get away with him. And then he's putting his children and my cousin in a lot of danger, and then thinking it was just this grand adventure when it was all over. It's a lot.
What you described before was effectively a psychological death, that you have gone through the psychological death of your father as you knew him, because that has ceased to exist as an identity. Now you know and think of him as BTK, as you were saying, and putting the pieces together. So since that, in managing that grief, in realizing that death, in realizing and processing your father's identity as BTK, have you forgiven him? And have you ever communicated with him since learning of his arrest?
Yeah. So right early on, we knew he was confessing. The FBI told us that first night, and they had told us they had found, his serial killer treasures, IDs and jewelry from the victims underneath our floorboards. So those little things you wrestle with, like reality versus what you don't want reality to be, and those things start wedging in and become reality. So within the first week or so, I wrote him a letter, and I was like, look, basically, if you did this, you need to plead guilty. Like we know it, like do the right thing. So my brother wrote him, my mom wrote him, all family wrote him. People would go visit him early on. And he did actually plead guilty then in June of 2005 instead of putting everybody through a trial. But we weren't sure if he was, and he was sort of holding that and toying with it and playing with it and holding it against us. I wrote him some then for a few years, and then I got pregnant with my oldest, my daughter, in 2007, and I got very protective and I shut down for several years. So I didn't write my dad for like 5 years. Then I was starting to work through some of what I had been through and starting to share at church. And I had stood up and shared some of my story with church in 2012. But I said, hey, I haven't forgiven him and I don't know what to do about that as a Christian. And then it was like God was working on me that whole fall. And I actually just gone to a movie and I was coming back. And it was like this light hit the car. And I had to pull over. I was sobbing. And it was just like I had released some of that anger, and I had forgiven my father. And it wasn't for me. It was definitely a God thing. I would have never been able to do it on my own. And so I went home. I told my husband, and then I sat down and I typed out like a 6-page letter. And at the end I said, Dad, I love you. I forgive you. And if you accept Christ, you'll be in heaven someday, forgiven for everything you've done. And some people get really mad at me about that, but I was dying inside. I was rotting from that, holding all that anger in and all that stuff. So I had to let it go. I was letting go of what my dad had done to me. I wasn't saying Dad's forgiven for what he's done to these 7 families or the community. I was just letting it go for myself so that I could come back alive. And so my husband said, as soon as I forgave my dad, it was like I was becoming Carrie again and not BTK's daughter. Mm-hmm. And so like the last 11 years now, I go back and forth between myself. Like I keep having to fight to find myself more and more. Like I'm coming more alive, but I still have to remember that I'm me and I'm not his daughter in that, not just in that context.
Yeah, that makes me think of, the peace of Christ Jesus that surpasses all understanding, mm-hmm. that will guard and protect your heart. And that peace can only be found. That's God's peace, to your point. It's
right.
Far beyond clearly the limitations of us as humans. And I'm grateful for your articulation. And that's exactly what I meant. The forgiveness you extended for the wrongs he did to you. Mm-hmm. You're not absolving him mm-hmm. of those murders. That forgiveness comes obviously from God and also from each family individually. This is about your relationship with him and the peace you experienced upon releasing that anger, which, to your point, after 10 years before even talking about it, this is an ongoing process for you. 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Yeah.
What's the thing that helps you the most now in this moment with your family and your children, your writing and helping others, and that the constellation of everything together? But at this moment, what is your best resource?
I guess I'm learning that when God is firmly in my corner, so he's a major resource, but also I'm trying to learn that I am a resource. So if I remember, I take all these pieces of all the times I've been in trauma therapy. I take bits of conversations. Today I read a victim's impact statement from a family member attached to the Lori Vallow trial. Right. So I read that, I shared it, I saved it. I take all these things. I take the light and the outdoors, and that's what I run on. So literally today, I was up early. I was sharing a story of a domestic violence victim that was murdered in Detroit this weekend, where I had lived for several years. And then I was like, okay, I'm triggered. So I have that self-awareness and self-care knowledge to go, okay, I'm triggered. What do I do next? So I went outside on my lanai and I anchored. So literally for me, that's okay. Find 3 things you can see. So light, trees, cat. Okay. 2 things you can hear, birds and bugs. And 1 thing you can feel, the ground. And then, okay, I'm untriggered. Okay, come back in and work. So literally for me, it's just being centered, remembering all of my tools, everything I've got, everybody that's in my corner, and then using that to go do what I need to go do. And if I don't remember, then I have to wave the flags and get help.
Yeah. And just by articulating that process, I'm sure you're helping so many others who don't know where to start, who don't know what to do in those moments of being triggered. That's so helpful. That's really an incredibly powerful tool that you're spreading and sharing. And Carrie, before we close, before we have your final thoughts that I would love for you to share with listeners of how they can help, or what message you want to leave everyone with, I just wanted to ask, because I failed to do this a moment ago, did your father respond to you with those letters that you wrote him? Did you get responses from him?
Oh, yeah. So after I forgave my father in December 2012, I got a Christmas card, a letter saying that I basically restored his Christmas spirit with my words. And then we did better for some years, back and forth, talking and being more open. And I was sharing some about the kids in my life. Dad and I never directly talked about his crimes or his acronym. We just kind of stuck to, okay, this is my life in Michigan. And he stuck to, this is what I'm eating in prison kind of stuff. So we were good for a while. And then what happened was when I started speaking up, he didn't really care for me having the spotlight and the attention. And so he pushed himself back into the media, and he still does to this day. I was speaking up in January due to the Idaho 4 arrest with Kohberger. And so my dad showed up right away back in the media. So I had to cut my dad off. So I cut my dad off legally 2 years ago with this do not contact order that the prison helped me get. Because he was just doing a lot of really awful things. He was cyber stalking me through third parties and trying to find out where I lived and signing crime scene photos, profiting off of murder memorabilia, just really bad things my father should not have been doing. And so he finally just crossed too many lines with me, and I had gotten strong enough. Really, that was really it. After 40 some years, I was strong enough to cut him out of my life. So we don't have any relationship. So then people bark at me and argue, well, you forgave me, but you're not in a relationship. And I said, look, sometimes it's not safe to be in relationship with somebody. You can forgive somebody and have them keep them over there because it's not safe to be in relationship with this person. That's not, forgiveness isn't about going back in relationship. It's just letting things go and moving on with your life and living. And then don't let the bad people in your life. That's all you're saying. You're not saying, hey, come back in my life. No, we have boundaries. We have boundaries for a reason.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Forgiveness is not mutually exclusive with boundaries, nor is it mutually exclusive with your health and safety,
right.
Obviously.
Yeah.
And forgiveness is for you.
Yeah.
Your forgiveness is for you.
Right.
And so is your self-preservation, and so is your setting boundaries to make sure you remain safe in all facets of that word. You mentioned the Idaho murders, and there was a resurface of BTK and of your words in the media at that time, and certain hypotheticals, certain things that were raised and questions that were raised at the time. If you want to share on that, I'm all ears. If you'd like to share about your thoughts or the parallels drawn or the suppositions that were drawn at the time that haven't proved founded.
Yeah. So right when Kohberger was arrested, it came out that he studied under Dr. Ramsland, who is a criminology professor at DeSales University in Pennsylvania. So Kohberger did his last 2 years of his undergrad and then his 2-year master's under Ramsland. Now, we're still debating, was that online or was it in person or was it both? And then with the pandemic, nobody's really been able to fully answer that. But anyway, he studied under Ramsland, and Ramsland recommended him, as far as I know, for the doctorate program in Washington. So as soon as I heard Ramsland's name, my PTSD just flared up on December 30th when Brian was arrested because of my father. It was just too close to home because Dr. Ramsland had worked really closely with my dad for years. They wrote a whole book on my dad. They co-wrote a book. She plays chess with my dad via letter. She phone calls him, visits him in prison. They have a very tight relationship. And my dad used Ramsland and me and would play us against each other for years. So there's a lot of history there with Dr. Ramsland for me. And then to find out that here's this so-called expert on psychopaths who's very close to my father, who's a psychopath, who's now taught what we assume if Kohberger is guilty is psychopathic behavior. She missed that. And so I started speaking up because I was concerned, well, what if Kohberger had contacted my father? Mm-hmm. As far as we know, we don't have any evidence of that. My dad came out and said no on Kohberger. Are they writing each other now? Who knows? Is Ramsland writing Kohberger? Is Ramsland going to do a Kohberger book? Is she going to be an expert? Is she going to be called in as a witness? Nobody knows these things right now.
What message, Carrie, do you have? What final message would you like to share with listeners for anyone?
I think it's just really important to know, you might not think you can survive whatever you're going through. And whatever you're going through, it is hopefully not what I've been through, but some people have been through way worse than me or are going through way worse than anything I've ever been through right now. So whatever you think it is that you can survive, you can. You've got to get help. So I should have got into trauma therapy early, right away. I didn't. So get help, ask for help, whatever help that is that you need. Just tell somebody, and then one foot in front of the other, even if it's just 1 minute in front of the next. Literally just make a decision, make a choice, and then go do that. Even if it's, okay, today I'm going to sweep my floor. If that's all you're going to get done, at least you've done something. So you have to make these decisions. So 10 years out from his arrest, I literally was still having to make that decision. Okay, this really sucks what happened to me. It's god awful. It shouldn't have happened. Completely altered my life. Completely altered everything I know about the world. Okay, what am I going to do with it? And then I made that decision. So I kept getting help. I started writing, I started speaking, and now I'm helping other people. So I'm still having to decide, what am I going to do with this? It sucks. I'd never wanted any of this. I never asked for any of it, but you have to do something with it. So just make a decision and choose to stay alive, basically.
My takeaway after talking with you, Carrie, is just how brave you are, how strong you are, and that you perfectly exemplify everything that you just said. This inspiration to others that horrible things can happen to people that they have no control over, and that trauma is so real and so shattering. And I'm so grateful to you for seeing how you took what is an difficult to even articulate tragedy that you've experienced and are continuing to experience, and how much you are sharing with such vulnerability and such honesty with others, how they can get that same help. And I'm just so grateful to you. And I just see you as so strong, so strong. And I want to make sure that everyone, I would love for them to read Breaking Free, Overcoming the Trauma of My Serial Killer Father and A Serial Killer's Daughter, My Story of Faith, Love, and Overcoming, which are the 2 books that you've written, which provide much more detail and much more insight into your processing and into your life and into the help that you can be for others who might be experiencing the same thing.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.